it's almost like trauma bond all the time when you have, people that you've worked with or currently work with, and you're dealing with these difficult
Yeah.
situations.
Well, Brooke, thank you for coming in today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So, give us a little background about you, first of all.
Yeah, I have been a social worker for about 11 years, and I have been pretty passionate about being an advocate for children and families. I got involved in social work because of my family. They had done foster care when I was in high school, and then later they've adopted several children. And I didn't graduate from college. I ended up going back and getting my major in human services so I could be a social worker.
Okay. So, what made you get started in social work to begin with? What was really that drive to make it happen?
I think just seeing how my family had workers in their homes and just kind of maybe just a lack of advocating for foster families and for the children. I really didn't understand how things worked, and I just wanted to help and kind of be a difference.
So, when you say advocating for, because there's going to be a lot of people that are watching this that have never been exposed to the system. So, when you say advocating for, what is it exactly that you mean by that?
So, advocating for children who have been abused or neglected, advocating for that family unit to be together if they can, and just advocating also for foster parents and just how they're treated too as well.
Okay. Is that something when you're talking about like foster families or families in general? Obviously, there's a reason that they have gotten into the system to begin with. Is that something that's kind of prevalent right now, that there's a lot of exposure of families to that system?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot more than people realize, and it seems like it's the cases are a little bit more demanding than they used to be when I first started.
Okay. So I guess we got a little bit ahead of the game because I got excited about that one little
Yeah.
thing. So you went back to school and you got a degree, I'm assuming in social work.
Yeah, my degree's in human services.
Okay.
I have a bachelor's.
And where did that take you when you got out of college?
At the time when I was finishing up my degree, I was working in a home for unwed mothers, and it was really it was a ministry that really didn't have a lot of money pay wise. I mean, it was a kind of it was more of a ministry than really. I mean, I was not going to be able to make ends meet on that. And so that's when I looked into doing social work with families.
This
in the
still probably
system.
didn't pay
Yeah.
too much.
Yeah, no, it didn't. No, no.
So when you got into your first getting away from the unwed mothers and into the I'm assuming probably state or governmental system, whatever that looks like. What was it that you were doing out of the gate in there?
Case management, really working with children. I was writing reports. We did a lot of ensuring that the parents were doing what they needed to do to get their kids back. I was also supervising visits for parents. That was really interesting to be able to see how the parents interact with children, which, sometimes you don't always get to see that.
So can you go into a little bit more depth on what that means?
What? I'm sorry.
The supervised visits, what that means.
So, parents typically, if their children are removed from their care, then they have what is called supervised visits, and they have to be observed in a setting, whether that's home or out in the public. And so it'd be time to kind of just see how parents are interacting, if they were able to, if they needed assistance. And really, it was just kind of sitting back and just watching and observing like a fly on the wall, not really interacting at all, just to make sure that the kids were safe.
Was you mentioned it right out of the gate, but that had to have been extremely weird sitting there, and I mean, even from the parents' perspective, having someone over their back while they're trying to have family time with their kids.
Yes, it is. It was weird at first. After you build a rapport with families, obviously it's not as awkward, but at first it is kind of weird. And a lot of families were hesitant to see, especially as the case manager, to come in and oversee that. There was oftentimes that they felt a little bit like they needed to be on guard. And so it was hard to see them really interact, that they probably would if I hadn't been there. But it it really gave me an opportunity to see how parents interacted, and I think that was good to be able to understand the bond that they had between them and their children.
Gotcha. Now, what would actually cause that sort of scenario to be set up to begin with? Because obviously, under normal circumstances, parents aren't going to have to be supervised for their kids. So, what would place them in that position to where they would need to be supervised?
Yeah, anytime that there were, we have a parent that has like maybe substance use, or there's been like physical abuse. We just want to ensure that there's that safety, and it could be verbal, it could be emotional abuse, or physical, and there's also, we have sexual abuse with parents. So it's just really ensuring that safety. All different walks of life we've seen. It's, abuse it's not just poverty. We've had high profile cases where, there's been people that you wouldn't think that would be involved, and they are.
So you go through your first job, and these are the types of things that you're doing. What's next for you when your next position comes along?
And I'm sorry.
In social work.
Yeah, like in the future for me? I'm sorry.
No. From that point where you entered
Okay.
the workforce to the next job that you took.
Yeah, so I ended up coming to Iowa to do social work here. When I first started, I was in Illinois, and so it was a very different system there compared to here. And so I became a social worker here for about 5 years, and then I left and did some different kind of case management, and then end up coming back, and so doing that direct case management.
Okay. And case management, for people who don't know, is
social work, and it all varies. There's different, right now it's how I handle case management is direct social work.
Gotcha. So let's switch gears here for just a second, because talking a little bit broadly about what you have done, is there a certain type of person that it takes to do this kind of work?
I think somebody who has thick skin, obviously somebody who is passionate about helping. You really get put in a lot of unique situations, difficult situations. I think it's somebody who knows that it's not for the faint heart. Not everybody can do this long term. or even sometimes short term, just because it is a hard, demanding job, both emotionally, physically. It impacts family, your home life, and so really having that balance. It's good to somebody who is able to categorize family versus work.
Yeah. And that is, something I had somebody in a previous podcast, and we were talking about that, and they're in a public service role as well. And, that was a conversation that we had, is how you make that separation between work and home, because you do see things that the normal person doesn't see, which means the normal person doesn't quite have a true appreciation for the things that are really going on in this world. So as a social worker, how do you turn that off when you go home? Because that's really interesting to me, how people are able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's taken a lot of time for me to be able to turn that off before I would go home and I would rehash things that had happened during the day or think a lot about a family. I've really, as I've grown as a worker, I've been able to kind of step away from that. But it has really directly impacted, I think, because your closest people that you want to talk to, you can't share everything. There's because of confidentiality, you can't share all the details, and it really makes things hard when those who love you know that your job and what you do, but you can't share everything. And so a lot of that camaraderie and a lot of that emotional support is, I feel like, helps when you have good coworkers, because you can share that information in like supervisors, because you can talk freely about things.
And do you feel like you've had that support over the years?
I think so. There's times where I feel like it was probably lacking, but I think overall, I think I've really worked with a lot of great people. I always tend to find one or two that I can really connect with and share. And even, just even former coworkers who know what I'm going through, and they get it. So it's almost like trauma bond all the time when you have, people that you've worked with or currently work with, and you're dealing with these difficult situations.
Yeah. Speaking of difficult situations, I know that that's probably very wide spanning, but are there predominant issues that you see typically?
I'd say substance abuse is the main type of case that I see, or that I have on my caseload. Physical abuse is another one, and that's really a difficult one to deal with, because when you're dealing with like substance, you have either a drug test positive or negative, and with physical abuse, it's harder to be able to manage if that abuse is going to reoccur and when the kids go back home, or
Right.
yeah.
And with the abuse component of that, I'm assuming in some cases that's a little bit harder to determine as factual at times, because you have children that don't want to tell on their parents, and that makes it a little bit more difficult, I'm assuming.
Yeah. 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 The one thing that I've seen is that children always tend to be loyal to their parents and love their parents, and don't, even there's just that sense of loyalty. And I think we were just born with that. And so a lot of children, it is hard. I feel like there's been times where that a kid wants to tell you, but they're afraid, and that's hard. That is really hard.
Now, I know the area of the state that we're in, we have one of the higher poverty rates in the state, and as such, we also have one of the higher incidents of confirmed cases of abuse, of confirmed cases of drugs in the home, up to and including the children receiving drugs in the home. There was a state work study or state student study, sorry, that really backed that up with data from the children. Do you see the children being fairly open for at least some of that? You know, when you finally get them to talk, are they fairly open, or do they still remain closed?
I think for the most part, they are pretty open. I've had some kids that either they've been through the system before or had, involvement with their parents. And so it's hard for them to trust or want to say anything. A lot of it's the older children. And I've had some kids that I know have been coached. And so that's really hard. So, I think I just dropped my thought.
So when you're looking at these cases, do you see a lot of I can't really think of a better word, recidivism, with the parents coming through multiple times into the system, or is it basically one and out for a lot of folks?
I would say that there's a lot of times that we see the same families over and over. Either they have additional children that, it's maybe they've had a baby and now we're involved again. But I'd say there's more of the same repetitive families.
Okay. And do you see over, like, say, the last 5 or so years, do you see more severity of cases coming through, or is it more or less the same as it's always been?
Yeah, I feel like the cases are worse now than they had been when I first started. The substance use is grown. When I first started, marijuana was, we'd remove a child or there, be involvement with a child very early on. And now, with laws changing and stuff and it all just kind of depends on the situation. But now it's more of the heavier drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines. We're seeing a lot of those stronger drugs, I guess. All still illegal, but it's just the cases that used to be the marijuana cases we we had more of than what we do now.
Okay. And what about the abuse cases? How have those gotten worse, or have those pretty much stayed the same?
I feel like they're actually getting worse too, than we had before.
Now,
I've
is there a correlation between the drug use and the abuse, or are they disconnected a little?
Not all the time. A lot of times it's just physical abuse or sexual abuse. Yeah, I don't, it's, yeah, I would say that there's not really substance and then physical abuse.
Okay. And how are, when you're talking about the sexual abuse and the physical abuse, set aside bruising, how are these folks actually getting caught?
Sometimes it could be, if the kids are at school and they confide in a teacher or confide in their counselor, if they're in counseling. Sometimes it's a neighbor just looking out for a kiddo and concerned. Sometimes it's like if they're divorced and that kid's with the other parent and that child confides in the parent about the abuse in the home, that's a way that we find out about it. So all kind of different ways that we do find out.
Has the government agencies, have they, over the course of years, have they been able to pinpoint anything that really is the determining factor of why, number one, we have the abuse, and number two, if it is escalating, why is it escalating?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. But what I can tell you that is a lot of the families that we work with, a lot, have had themselves as children, the adults, the parents, they were abused, whether it's sexually or physically, or there were substance. So there, it always seems like there's some type of a correlation, that there's a reason why, and not justifying that, but understanding. And I think that's important to get to that root cause of why parents act the way they do.
Okay. And when you actively find these situations and, a child is removed from a home, what's the path forward look like for those kiddos?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the situation, obviously, but the goal would be for them to go back home, and there's steps that the parents have to take to get that to have them return home. Whether it's counseling, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's like play child interactive therapy, where they're being monitored by a professional when they're with their child, kind of helping them direct parenting. Could be parenting classes. There's all kinds of different situations, or not situations, but different. It kind of just depends on why they got involved. So I don't know if that answered
Well,
that. Yeah.
so I'm assuming that's barring whether a parent actually had to go to jail, given what they did, right?
Right. Right.
Okay. And if they did, if there is like, punishment from the parent's perspective, what usually ends up happening to those children?
So it just, like, if they were, I'm
Like if
sorry.
they were removed from the home or something, the parent goes to jail. What ultimately happens to those kiddos?
Yeah, so it could be where they are placed with another family member, placed with a different parent. They could be placed with an adult sibling. Foster care is another placement option. I think the way things are handled now, we really try to advocate for those close relationships. So we've I've seen kids placed with teachers, people that they're close to. I've heard, and I've heard that, we've even had somebody that was a close friend, meaning like it was somebody that the kids saw at the store all the time, like down the block.
Okay.
So has just that connection and is able to connect with the child and have that child in their home.
So, in this instance, is there follow up with the kid to make sure that they're still being treated appropriately after they've been made in this temporary placement?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So they're being seen and observed by multiple workers in their home
Okay.
or placement.
So, what are some of the, obviously, confidentiality is important, but what are some of the worst cases that you've seen personally?
I we had a sexual abuse case where the child was a baby, and the parent sexually abused the child. The baby, I think the baby at the time was maybe 2 or 3 months old. And that was devastating. It, I know one of my coworkers it really impacted my coworker too. But I think that was one of the worst cases that I had in my career.
So, going back to the beginning when we were talking about, how do you disconnect from that? When you see something as profound as that is, obviously, if you haven't seen anything like that to that point, how do you reconcile that at the end of the day and go home and shut that down?
Yeah, I think a lot of I think it helps to have, again, that support system, both at home and at work. You know, again, home is a little different, but just having that support, and able to really be able to process. I think things now are a little different where, you know, they're seeing that the trauma is impacting the workers, and just being able there there's a kind of a system. I haven't had a chance to or opportunity to use it, but there's kind of a system when there's such an in-depth case or traumatic case that,
Like an employee assistance
like, yeah,
program? Okay.
yeah. So I think that that helps too, having that there.
So to counter that, what are some of the better things that you've seen along the way?
Seeing parents who have been involved for substance completely changed their life around. In particular, one case I'm thinking of, she ended up going back, getting her degree. She did some counseling, or not counseling, but some substance abuse, where she was a counselor, and has really just changed her life. Has her children back, is thriving. A lot of, I think, and you know, a lot of that is I've been able to continue a relationship and see that grow, and that's what is kind of gets me motivated, is to see those clients that I've had before that have changed their lives around, and say, it was, if it weren't for you, you know. And it wasn't me, it was just me believing that they could do it, and they had to do the work to put it in. But just really encouraging. I feel like I've done that a lot. Not always, but you know, I try to really encourage families and those parents, even when they don't feel like they can. You know, just really trying to give them hope.
Yeah. When we talk about, over the last 5 years or so, things seem to be escalating. What is it? I mean, if there's even an answer to this, as a society, that we're not getting right, that is causing, the increased substance abuse, the increased physical abuse or sexual abuse. What are we missing? Is there governmental problems? Are there familial problems that's causing the breakdown?
I would say that I think a lot is mental health services. There seems to be lacking. It's difficult when children or even parents need those services and they're not available, or they have to wait for them, because there's such a need of like mental health. And I think that's a huge component, is that we have a lack of resources. I'd say that that's the biggest thing that I've seen.
Okay. And even with the advent of teletherapy or anything, that still hasn't helped curb any of that at all.
I think it has, especially, you know, in the more rural areas. It still is difficult. I know I currently have a case where clients working with telehealth, but it's substance, and it's difficult when, you know, you're doing a drug test and not being monitored, and that's a concern, you know. So it's hard to be in these rural towns using those telehealth, you know, and for substance, it doesn't always work. So that's where I think it's hard and difficult, is when, you know, you have individuals who don't have, you know, may not have a job, may not have good transportation, and then they're trying to get to a substance abuse, you know, treatment or ongoing treatment, and they can't. And so it's those lack of resources, or even just transportation. Okay. So that could be.
So if we're having a rise of mental health related issues in the country? Is it just we're truly having a rise in mental health issues, or is it we're recognizing that those mental health issues exist now? Because I think that sometimes that's a little bit of a confusion point for people.
Yeah, I think maybe, I don't know. I mean, personally, I think it's a rise that we're seeing it, and I think especially after COVID, things seem to be a little bit more on that front line of recognizing that there's more mental health needs or issues. So
Okay.
I could be wrong, but
Yeah.
that's what I see in my opinion.
Well, it's interesting. We heard a lot of social workers when COVID hit and everybody had to stay at home, and the claims for child abuse plummeted, and people were saying, "Oh, that's great," and all of the social workers are saying, "No, that's actually terrible. We have a problem here." Can you go into a little bit of depth and explain why that was a bad thing?
I think because when it's almost like a joke that when school's in session is when things get busy, because you have teachers that see and observe and hear, and they're they're the ones who see what's happening in those homes. And so when COVID hit and those kids were not in school, I think that was a huge, things were happening, we just weren't able to see it. So that's just kind of my thought. I don't know if that's right at all. But when you have extra eyes on children, like a teacher, that's where we see, because children are there. They're at school, 8 hours a day, and children talk, and or teachers see what's going on and have concerns. So that's just my thought. I don't know if that's at all accurate of what happened there. But typically when school's in session is when, because school's been out for the summer, and then we see a more higher calls or more involvement when school's back in session.
Okay. When you're talking about things like that, people live inside their bubbles, and you're obviously not inside people's homes, so you can't see what's going on. If as a society we want to move away from the increase in abuse and everything, what does the normal person need to do when they don't even recognize that abuse is happening in a home? Is there even an answer to that?
Yeah, I don't. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Because I have talked to several people that they would say that that's a rare thing, is to have abuse in the home, and clearly it's not. And you try to tell them, no, this is a normal occurrence in the family unit, but and then they're shocked when they see it on the news that somebody just was arrested for child pornography, or selling their child, or they were raping a 2-year-old. How do you convince them that it actually exists?
Yeah, I think it's hard to wrap your head around it when you don't think that it could happen in your town or with your neighbor or even your family, And I think that education is a big piece, and especially, I don't know, when people aren't aware, it's harder to realize that it's really happening. It's almost like that blind eye. Well, if we don't see it, it didn't happen. And so, I think it's really, I think it's hard to wrap your head around when you don't when you're not thinking that that could happen.
Talking about the sexual abuse specifically, you know, obviously the goal in most situations is to get the family reunited. Reunification in this state has been an issue that most politicians and leaders have taken pretty seriously over the last few years. But there's always the question of how do you reunify families when sexual abuse is the cause of the separation. So can you go into a little bit of a detail about how you balance that out?
Yeah, it's a really difficult, I think that's one of the most difficult cases to have, or, it depends on who the perpetrator is or if there's like criminal charges involved. I think that, where I think, sorry, I think it's just a really hard situation, and it's hard to know that that kid's going to be safe again, without the parents going through therapy, through, you know, not rehabilitation, but just seeing if they're going to perp again. And it's really, I think that's one of the most difficult cases.
Yeah, I would have to think that, that pretty much everybody that's on the kiddos side on that is really on edge when, you start talking about abuse, that type of abuse in the home, because I don't know if recidivism is high on that, but when you're talking about crimes of convenience, then the child's placed back in the home. I'd have to think that convenience factor is still there.
And it really also, I think, you know, when there's been sexual abuse, what the other parent, if they were aware of it, and a lot of times they're not, the other parent is not aware of the situation, or it could be a step parent, or I've seen a lot of parents who have said that that didn't happen and don't want to believe it. And that's what's heartbreaking, is when there's been sexual abuse to a child and the other parent who should be advocating for the kid is not. Even when there's evidence, even when there's, it's painted out the whole picture, they still don't believe. And so that's what also is difficult.
That has to be infuriating. So how do you convince that person that that's actually happening?
Sometimes you can't. I mean, sometimes I've had cases where, they will end up losing their children because they don't believe it ever happened. And that's what's hard. Yeah.
I don't even know what to say about that. So, what's the future look like for you?
I don't know. I don't know if I will. I know that social work is near and dear to my heart. I will always be in this line of field, I'm sure. Whether it's direct case management, I don't know. The cases are just getting more difficult, and it's not what it was when I first started. And not that I'm not passionate about it. It's really getting more difficult as the years go on, and as I get older. I think that could be it too. I'm not in my 20s anymore.
Right.
So,
Right.
As we get older, it's harder, I think, to see what has happened, and harder to, just really allow things to let let go and not have to worry about it. Cause, you know, I don't know. I do believe there's good in the world and I do believe in people, but sometimes it's really hard when, you know, you have children who didn't ask to be hurt.
Yeah.
And so that's just, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
And then you know that those children are going to have a pretty rough go moving forward. You know, those things affect a child for the
Yeah.
rest of their lives. Whether you know whether they can get past it or not is one thing, but it's still going to have an imprint on who they are as a human the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. And I always think, you know, it's, you know, how you were, you know, if you've even had abuse in your life and what you've done with it. I mean, I'm not excusing parents for what they've done, but I can understand why. Doesn't make it right, but I understand that there's a root to that. So,
Okay, what if you could get a message out to the general public that might not understand? They might understand that this happens, but they might not fully understand it because they grew up privileged enough to be in a two-parent, nice, loving home. What would that message be that you would want them to know?
I think just know that there's always two sides of the story. A lot of times I feel like they don't hear that there's more to this. There is more to the story. And so, you know, when you're hearing things on the news, there's more to that than what we know.
So you're telling me that the news isn't always
I am.
all accurate.
I am telling you that.
Oh my!
Yeah, I know. I know it's a big shocker. This is groundbreaking right now. And I think the other thing would be is just to have compassion and know that, you know, to be maybe, I don't know, be a little bit more open to see what's going around and really looking out for those kids who don't have anyone, and maybe understand a little bit more of why kids are the way they are. You know, I think that also impacts really kind of maybe changing our mindset. So,
Well, Brooke, thanks for coming in.
yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.